Hello, everyone. Hello again. In this new presentation, in the first series about the third year undergraduate licence students concerning the linguistics course, we are going to talk today about theme 4. Theme 4 is about language contact and change. Just before I talk about the content of this theme 4, just I want to say that language contact and change is another area in addition to what we saw before, language variation, that sociolinguistics is interested in it. Now, language contact and change is another area that is usually due to when it comes to two groups that get in touch, or two groups meet because of neighborhood, or because a group of people gets in touch with another group through trade. That means in this case, we are talking about groups of people that speaking two different languages, they get in touch, and for the sake and for the need of communication, when the two languages are completely different and the people cannot communicate using one or the other language, generally there is something that happens regarding these two languages, and the result of what happens usually leads to manifestations of language contact and change. And here, before we talk about the examples and manifestations of language change, let's say that language contact, we repeat what we said before, that when two groups speaking two different languages meet, and in order to communicate, they try to create something between them based on the two language, one language or the other, or based on the two languages. This leads to change. So usually, before language change, there is a need for language contact. Very often, language contact is often manifested in terms. We have many manifestations of language contact. It could be just the creation of a new language between the two languages, or it could be a replacement parts of a language with another part from the other language, or it could be borrowing. You borrow from one language some words or expressions to be used in the other language, or it could just because due to some reasons one of the language will be dominant, the other one won't be dominant, and the non-dominant language may be extinguished. In clear terms, the manifestations or the outcomes of language contact could be examples such as what is mentioned on this slide: diaglossia, borrowing, language shift, language death and loss, Creole, Pigeon, and code switching. There are other, let's say, examples, but we will focus only on these examples simply because they are the most common ones. Now, let's see what is meant by these examples one by one, and we start with diaglossia. Diaglossia, generally, it has to do with the same language, and one person or a speaker of that language may have a reference to use two, let's say, types of this language. Generally, when we talk about diaglossia, we talk about the use of the formal language and the use of the informal language. For example, in Arabic language, we can have the formal Arabic language, the standard language, the language that we use in education, in schools, in administration, official documents, and there is the informal language, the language that is used in everyday conversations. A speaker of Arabic language may, at the same time, may use what we call the high standard form language, as well as he or she may use the low or informal language. Of course, the use of the high standard formal language and the low informal language depends on the purpose of communication, and also depends on where the speaker is. If the speaker is in a formal context, he has to use the high standard formal language. And if he is in an informal setting and context, he or she may refer to the low informal language. This is diaglossia. The second example of language contact is borrowing. Very simply, borrowing, it's because one language is very more prestigious. Sometimes there are some language. By the way, when we say prestigious language, this is not actually scientific. Why? Because in fact, according to linguistics and to modern linguistics, there is no language that is superior. There is no language that is inferior. There is no language that is civilized, if you can say, and there is no language that is under-civilized or primitive. All languages are the same, no matter what the language is. Whether the language is a lingua franca, a language that is universal, spoken by millions of people, and a language that is spoken only by a very small minority, a very small group of people that are living in a very far place, in a mountain or in the forest, in the Amazon, in a language that is spoken by those tribes that are in the Amazon, they are often said to be primitive people and civilized people, and they have their own language. So the language of those people compared to universal language, lingua franca, English language now, according to linguistics, they are the same. Since the language is that means of communication, there is communication. Someone says something and it is understood and the message is conveyed. So the language is similar. There is no difference. Now, when it comes to a non-linguistic, let's say, interpretation, ordinary explanation or explanation given by laymen, people who are not specialized. Of course, we may here see that there are differences between languages. We say this language is superior and this one is inferior. This one is civilized and this one is not civilized. Something else is that sometimes there are some languages, because of the power they do have, some languages they have some power due to media, due to the fact that the speakers of that language, they are well placed in some very powerful institutions in the country. Their language becomes, in fact, powerful and sometimes more dominant than other languages that they coexist with this language. Generally, because of this reflexivity, there is a dominant language and there is non-dominant language. Generally, there is a shift of words, expressions from the dominant language to the non-dominant language. Generally, we talk about here we talk this manifestation of language contact, which is borrowing. Now, something else about the examples of language contact, it's language shift. What is language shift? The language shift is, again, when the language of the majority displaces the language of the minority. And we have talked about this when we talked about borrowing. So language shift, it's the effect that may cause a language on another and upon another language. Because it is dominant, I said, because it has power, it may replace the language of the people who speak it, and it's considered to be non-dominant. Generally, we can have some factors that lead to language shift. For example of the first factors, they are economic, social, political factors. We can talk here about social status. We can talk about prestige, what I have mentioned it before, the work opportunities, the institutional domains, school, media, etc. So the shift can happen due to the economic, social, political factors. Also, there is another example of factors that has to do with demographic factors. This can be noticed when it is faster in urban areas than rural ones. Size of the group, intermarriage. All these factors, demographic factors, also can lead to language shift. The other example of language, of the factors that lead to language shift, we can talk about attitudes and values factors. So here, especially, it happens when a minority groups devalues its language. Language extinguishes, and it can be reduced until it dies. This is because of the values and because of the attitudes. Of course, in some cases, when language extinguishes, when language is devalued, when language is not valued, it's not given the right value because of its own speakers or because of the effect of the dominant language. What happens? This language may die. It may totally extinguish. We can see this especially with minority groups that live in immigration. The group speaking that language because no more use it, because they don't have the opportunity or opportunities to communicate using that language. Generally, this language dies, and the speakers of this language of different generations, they may adopt the language of the dominant group. In some cases, we have noticed that some languages have totally died, but because the people speaking or the generation that came up later on afterwards, they wanted to revitalize these died languages. So this happened, and we have many examples. In this case, we talk about language revival. There is another example of language, let's say language contact, and which is very significant, and we can notice that it is code switching. What we mean by code switching or mixing 2 or 3 languages, it means that usage of 2 languages in a mixed manner. This happens basically in multilingual communities, in bilingual communities. For example, in Algeria, since Algeria is, let's say, it's a multilingual country. Why? Because the national official language, there are 2, the Arabic language, which is a national official language in Algeria, and we have the Tamazight, and also because of the historical inheritance and because of colonization and because of the long period that took colonization in our country, Algeria, the French language was at some time was very used in our society. So what happens? We may, in our, let's say, Algerian Arabic language, we may find that people may code switch from Arabic to sometimes to French, sometimes to Tamazight, or to another language that is mastered by the speaker of this language. In this case, we are talking of code switching. Generally, when we talk about code switching, we talk about some reasons. Among these reasons, we can read, first one is the desire to express an idea in one language. Sometimes there is what we call gap in language. Sometimes some people, they master a language better than another one. When they speak in a language and they don't have this rich vocabulary storage, they don't find the words, they refer to another language they master to fill in the gap and find the word in another language. Sometimes another, let's say, reason of code switching is the desire to reveal a mixed identity. Yeah, in society, sometimes you find some people, let's say, to have this feeling of to show off or to show that they are, they know many languages. They code switch from one language to another language. So here we have two reasons. The reason to show that the speaker has a mixed identity, as well as the speaker wants to show off. Another reason is that the inability to express an idea in one language, and I talked about this as when I mentioned the there are gaps in terms of vocabulary, and sometimes even gaps in ideas. So a speaker, because he does not have the ability to express himself or herself in a language, he may or she may refer to another language to express his or her ideas in the other language. Of course, I talked about the other reason, lexical gap, and sometimes people, they code switch to have a better communication. Sometimes some people think that when they code switch, they may convey their ideas easily and in a good manner for the one who is listening to him or to her. So generally, these are the reasons of code switching. Now, let's talk about another manifestation, another outcome of language contact. It has to do with the pigeonization, and later on the creolization. What we mean by pigeon, it's generally when two people meet and are in need to communicate. They use words from both languages, mix morphology and syntax, use the simplest sounds from both languages. This happens especially for people who traded. This happened in the past, people who traded, and when they arrived into another location, another continent or country, and they want to communicate with the original inhabitants of that location, but they don't know, or they did not know how to communicate with them because the two languages they spoke were totally different. They created a common language. The specificities, particularities, characteristics of this common language that we call Pidgin, it had usually limited vocabulary, simple grammatical rules, small inventory sounds. It is spoken by few people, those who just come in contact or in touch with the other people in the other location. And generally, it's used only in a very short time and used for a given purpose. That's why many examples of these language contacts or contact languages that we call pigeons, they faded away and they died. However, some pigeons, they were currently used and they grew and they were transmitted by people to other people in the location where they were created, and they grew in space and in time, and with time they became spoken by large population. In this case here we talk about the other example of language contact, that is a creolization. So a Creole language means that one pidgin is passed onto a new generation, onto new generations, and becomes their first language. So it becomes a Creole. Overall, here we have presented in this, let's say, in this theme 4, we have talked about language contact, and that language contact often leads to language change. And we have talked about some examples of language contact, such as code switching, such as pigeonization, such as creolization, diaglossia, etc. That's all for this theme 4. Thank you very much indeed.